welcome everyone. My name is Michał Baranowski. I'm a director of the Warsaw office of the German Marshall Fund. It's a great pleasure to see you, my dear panelists, and see you on the other side of the camera, dear friends that are joining. I had a chance to look through the list of people who are joining us today, way over 100, maybe close to 200 people, but many good friends and colleagues. So it's really great to see you, even given that somewhat of a weird virtual setting. Coronavirus is changing our world. That goes without saying. Here at GMF, we wanted to begin to understand the way it's impacting international relations. So we thought, how about we invite the smartest people that we can think of in Poland, in Germany, in the US, to begin unpacking what is the impact that the virus is having on the leadership that we are seeing or not seeing in our countries. We are also facing battle of narratives. Some national narratives are very much focused on what's happening domestically. Some are almost nationalistic or quite nationalistic. Others are focused on the international dimension of the crisis. So we thought that the title Between Nationalism and Internationalism, Leadership at a Time of a Coronavirus, is the right title for and focus for our first discussion. We're going to be talking about Eurobonds. We're going to be talking about what's happening in Hungary. What's going to be what's happening throughout Europe. And to guide you through this discussion, we invited our colleagues, and I will pass it on to Rachel, who is editorial director at the German Marshall Fund, to kick off the discussion and moderate the discussion. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michał, and your colleagues in Warsaw for virtually hosting this event. It's pretty interesting. And I'm going to, as Michał said, I'm the editorial director of GMF. I'm going to introduce the three panelists who are just going to kind of give a wave, although I think you can also see their names. And after that, I'll ask an opening question. We're going to do about 35 minutes of discussion to leave plenty of time for discussion. So while I do want you to listen, you should also at some point start getting ready to ask some questions. I'll flag that again later. So I'm really happy to be talking to these three gentlemen about this really interesting question in the midst of very uncertain times. So first, I'll start with our local expert, who is Professor Marek Siekowski, who is Professor of International Relations at the Collegium Civitas in Warsaw. Hi, Mark, thanks for joining us.
Hello.
In Berlin, we have Thomas Kleiner-Brockhoff, who is Vice President at the German Marshall Fund and head of the Berlin office. Hi, Thomas. And finally, a little further away, we have Jascha Monk, who is sort of an expert on the crisis of liberal democracy, author of the book last year, The People versus Democracy, and most importantly, also a senior fellow at GMF. Hi, Jascha. So first, let's start with national responses, the leadership we've seen, the sort of instincts we've seen. I'm going to go in the reverse order and start with the sort of furthest away in this virtual space. So Jascha, you recently wrote a piece in The Atlantic, kind of reconsidering your decision to become an American as a result, basically, of the mess of response to this crisis. I mean, I don't think many would have expected Trump to deal with such a challenge well, but how bad is it? And what is it revealing about, both his leadership and kind of US more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, what I argue in the piece is that on most metrics that people would have applied before this pandemic hit, you would have expected the United States to do very well. I think most political scientists, in thinking about how a country would confront an unprecedented crisis, would have pointed to state capacity. And for various obvious reasons, the United States ranks perhaps not at the very top of state capacity in the world, but certainly towards the top. And there was actually an exercise done at Johns Hopkins University last year to develop with some international partners a sort of global public health index that was explicitly trying to figure out how well countries would do at confronting a crisis like this, and the United States came out at the very top. And yet what we've seen is, frankly, a complete mess of a response. A response that's far too slow, a response that's not coordinated at the federal level, a complete failure even by some of the less politicized institutions like the CDC to develop tests early on. They insisted on developing their own tests instead of trusting one developed by the WHO and others, and have then been unable, that ended up being faulty, and so have been unable to ramp up testing for a really long time. And I think it does force us to ask questions about the extent to which the deep partisanship, the lack of trust in experts, and also a sclerotic bureaucracy, even in the areas where the bureaucracy and the experts are making decisions, is hampering America's ability to take on the major challenges of the 21st century, whether they were the obvious ones like the rise of China, or whether they are less predictable ones like the outbreak of this pandemic. Now, I just want to caveat that with two things. The first is that I did end the article by saying it's not time to give up on the United States, and I'm not about to give up on the United States. And I do think that America also has some uniquely good things which allows it to ramp up a good response. So we're seeing in amazing speed things like the Javits Center in New York being converted into hospitals by the US Army Corps of Engineers. We are seeing a lot of private enterprise starting to develop personal protective equipment and ventilators in quite incredible speed. The first vaccine trial happened in the United States. So there's all kinds of amazing things about the United States which may yet get the country through this. So that's the first caveat. The second caveat, and I'll hand over to my fellow panelists, is that other countries have done very, very poorly as well. I mean, I think the primary lesson from this so far is not about any particular political system, any particular politician, or any particular geography. It's that virtually every country has reacted badly, done too little too late, still doesn't have a coherent strategy, and that's sadly true of a lot of countries in Europe as well.
So, Thomas, would you say that's true of Germany?
For the sake of conversation, I would, to make this lively, disagree with Yasha on this last point. I don't see a bad response in this country. We all see a late response because I think the human experience in our lifetime hasn't taught us to take a virus as seriously as we should, and even small incidents on small infection chains as seriously as we should. But given that, Germany would have to be another country where you would say state capacity is relatively high. And the response in my book is relatively adequate. Let me make 2 or 3 points on this. The first one is a caveat. Federalism has been a weakness in this initially, but it looks to me it's going to turn out to be rather a strength than a weakness. So federalism has produced a rocky start because folks were all over the map. States disagreed with each other. Communication wasn't the same everywhere. People were confused by different measures. Since they weren't realizing the depth of this threat, they were confused by conflicting messages from regional authorities. But that was a very initial piece of the response. Once sort of everybody got the message, and that included some state governors, I think the difference in they're all pulling the same. They're all pulling their weight now, and the message is similar. The differences are small, and they can be different responses given that we have different environments from urban and rural, and distinctions between those. I also think the leadership has been solid to start at the top. Merkel's speech on the issue was appropriate. It was actually her first in 14 years, believe it or not. She's been in office for 14 years, going on 15. I think not only is it the first of these TV addresses, she hasn't used that instrument even once, but it was easily the best speech of her tenure, because she hit the tone just right, and she she also proved that she is the ultimate authority in this country, still as a lame duck, because she hit a tone that people were willing to accept, and they're following the speech are willing to accept, including limitations to freedoms and civil liberties. And the way she did that, I think, was with a combinations of empathy and decisiveness. There was no nationalism in it. There wasn't even a language. There wasn't even the Macron language of war or the Trump language. The combination of the bullet and the virus. They're essentially the same thing. There's none of that. There's also no nationalism. There was an appeal to civic responsibility. And there was a no-nonsense scientist at work. It was no drama Angela. And people like that. That in a crisis moment, there's something reassuring in a leader that is no-nonsense. So I think she reestablished some of the credentials that she has as a crisis manager, even to those people who'd like to see her go after all of these years. Okay. Second elements, the decisions in this country are now taken and executed, something that you wouldn't have taken for granted. This no longer is the country that cannot finish an airport for a decade because of excessive regulations and also including rights to obstruct infrastructure decisions. So things are happening. And people seem to like that. Thirdly, there is the power of citizenry. I see enormous resources in volunteerism, in willingness to pitch in. There's a sense of solidarity, amazing philanthropy, probably very similar to some of the things we see from the US. And there is, of course, a debate on civil liberties. I could not have imagined being in a country that suspends the freedom of assembly. But I think we're in the midst of a debate of whether voluntary citizenship in terms of mobile phone tracking can achieve what authoritarian countries do by decree. So I think this will also be a very good test. So far, so good. Over to Marek.
Yes. Marek, Thomas said in the German response, he didn't see a lot of nationalist language, or at least in Merkel's leadership in this. And he thinks Germany is dealing with it relatively well. What would you say about the Polish response?
Principally, I would say that at this stage now, the response has to be assessed positive. It was a little bit maybe belated, 1 week maybe, but still this response to the epidemic crisis in Poland was quick and adequate, and understandable in the communication to the society, which I think is a very important thing. And we are now in the 3rd week of the national quarantine, and you can't see any signs of rejection, any signs of great criticism in the society. Society is rather disciplined and follows the new rules. But we are talking now about the situation which is just the beginning of problems which are ahead of us. So what we estimate and what we take as positive or negative, it is related mainly to the very first moments of the crisis, because everyone in Poland is aware of the fact that we have to expect in the consequence of this crisis many economic troubles, and this can be a shock for the Polish society, because if you look at our history of the last 3 decades, we experienced the 3 decades of the constant economic growth. And now probably we should still us up to face a grave economic crisis. And we don't know exactly now how would government respond to this challenge, whether this response will be positive or negative. There is one point maybe I would like to add to the Polish situation, which is a crucial problem, because at the time of this crisis, we should organize in May presidential elections. So there is a new problem how to practice democracy at the times of a grave crisis like this. Of course, we have the example of Bavaria, which organized local elections. We have another distant example of South Korea. I think they will have elections in mid of April. But this issue of presidential elections in Poland, which should take place in May, is a high political issue now, and the center of a very serious political debate, whether it is possible at the time of such crisis to practice democracy and to proceed with presidential elections, or whether they should be postponed.
Thanks, Mark, for that. I think we're going to return later to the questions of what the response to the crisis is kind of doing to national democracies and leadership and different possibilities that they have. Talking also about Hungary a bit in this context. There's also elections that are in a weird kind of, or the run up to an election campaign that's in a weird kind of pause mode in the United States as well. With the Democratic primary, so it's it's also interesting. But first, I want to get into we covered the sort of how the national response is working within the nation, and Thomas said that in Merkel's speech, she used the right kind of tone. She didn't have any nationalist language, but she also didn't really have any European language or any international language. And last weekend, President Macron from France, he gave an interview to Italian media and said something about what he's most worried about is the illness of every man for himself. And certainly the initial response, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that I'm seeing everywhere is, was national. Maybe that also makes sense. There have been, in lots of countries, Poland may be an example, Belgium, Spain, there's a kind of initial, even cohesive response around governments that might have been in trouble. But there wasn't any kind of instinct for international cooperation or European solutions. We're going to go second to the bigger question about afterwards. But first of all, Thomas, I'm going to go to you. In terms of maybe the second level responses, so not the very initial responses, but the correction within Europe to this nationalist response. Have we seen enough? Are we seeing just the beginning of kind of pooling and sharing efforts in the direct response to the health crisis? Has the improvement been enough, quick enough? And then I'll either Yasha or Marek, you should join in after Thomas.
Now, first of all, I think we should understand that such an extreme moment of a crisis, we've seen the power of the nation state. This is the area where democratic legitimacy is created, and where the power of the executive finds legitimacy, including the power of emergency laws. So we shouldn't be surprised that the space of democracy is the nation state. That said, I think our man, as Macron puts it, each man to his own reaction was appalling. It is, and it continues to be completely inadequate. I think we're seeing a change on that front, but we should first acknowledge that there's a completely different response of nation states to this crisis than to the crisis 10 years ago, the financial and debt crisis. The first instinct in that crisis was international coordination. The first instinct in this crisis was huddle in your nation state, closed borders, do not coordinate. Now, I think we're in a different zeitgeist, and that zeitgeist shows. People have complained that we do not have international leadership to get us to this type of coordination. I would argue the opposite is true. We have international leadership, and people say we don't have American leadership. Yes, we do have American leadership. This is the leadership we're getting. We're living in a nationalist age. The Xi's, the Putins, the Kaczynskis, the Trumps, the Bolsonaros run this world. This is the first crisis under their patronage. This is what we're getting. We actually need to make the point that this is what you see is what you get. Now, in other words, there is a second virus going around, and that is the virus of nationalism. Even countries that are not run by nationalist leaders have caught the virus, including this country that hasn't. And as you correctly said, Merkel, Merkel's response, while it wasn't nationalist, it also wasn't Europeanist. I think by yesterday, we've taken in the first Spanish patient, the first. By now we have 14,000 ICU units. Not all of them are filled with patients, but only 100 patients from France and from Italy and now from Spain. We're doing probably as good as anybody in Europe, and I'm not aware that, let's say, Poland has offered any of its empty ICU beds to anybody so far, and I'm not aware of other countries doing massive efforts in that respect. We are not pooling and sharing, and we're starting to see that effort. Macron is one of them. German President Steinmeier has issued an appeal to that end yesterday. But we're late in the game, and that game will be a long game. So the second phase of response is going to be decisive as to whether this is a nationalist or an internationalist moment, because I would argue that this could be a great teaching moment for internationalism, because no crisis other than an epidemic or pandemic like this is more apt. It can only be beat by humankind working together. And it can even be a teaching moment like World War II, because everybody experiences the plight of this this moment, and only international cooperation can help solve it. So I think we're also going through a learning curve on this, and we're witnessing the learning curve.
So speaking of curves, I agree with a lot of what Thomas is saying, but I'm afraid that we're grading on a curve too much, both at the national and the international level. So to go back to Germany, I mean, I just wrote sort of the most gung-ho pro-German piece I've probably written in my life. So I think I can, I have a little bit of credibility that I am taking seriously the ways in which Germany is succeeding where America is failing right now. I was saying, what wouldn't I give right now to trade in our clowns and criminals here in the United States for Germany's somewhat boring but far more competent political leaders. So I agree with you on the relative comparison, but I think we're underplaying how badly Germany has failed as well. I mean, I see we have an august junior minister joining us in the participants list. Welcome to you. I was in a Twitter altercation with one of his colleagues 2.5 weeks ago, in which that colleague was telling me that corona is just like the flu. We've only just had the first death in Germany, and why on earth are people making such a ballyhoo about it? And the German press was saying for 2.5 months, the biggest danger is panic. Panic is the thing that's going to be really dangerous. Now, that makes sense when you're in a crowded theater, and if somebody shouts fire, people might get trampled to death. When the advice is, be careful about this virus, perhaps wear a mask, perhaps stay at home, I don't see how panic is supposed to be so dangerous. But I think there is a set of mental habits that German journalists and politicians and elites have, which is that we have a playbook from the post-war order. And whatever crisis comes, we just have to keep implementing this playbook without rethinking what the demands of this actual moment are. And the biggest danger is changing what we're doing. The biggest danger is taking action. That's what might go wrong. And I think whether it is talking about EU institutions incapable of dealing with the rise of what is now a bona fide dictator in our own ranks, or whether it is understanding the nature of a global pandemic, that's been a real hindrance. Now, when it comes to international reaction, I agree with Thomas much more, which is both to say that we need international reaction, and that's been shameful to what extent so far many countries have failed to assist each other. The one thing I would add to that, though, is that we've also been grading international institutions on a very, very generous curve, which is to say that when you look at the WHO, it has failed appallingly in this crisis. When you look at the United Nations, you know, I have friends who work for the United Nations. They were being told to come physically into their office. They had to take sick days in order not to come physically into the office long after most offices in New York City had closed down. So that just gives you an indication of the failure of ability to understand what was going on at the highest levels of the United Nations. And so, so I think that this is a moment in which we need to be self-critical, honestly, at every level of governance. And I would love to say, as somebody who is a great defender of democracy and who points at the ways in which democracy tends to work much better for citizens than dictatorship, and liberal leaders tend to work much better than populists. I do think there's some contrast there, and we might get into that a little bit later. But we're not doing as well as we should, and I think we got to be honest about that.
Marek, Thomas mentioned Poland specifically. Do you see any emergence of a kind of cooperative instinct or a more cooperative instinct in Poland? Where do you see this going? And do you agree with the picture of international failure and European failure so far?
I surely agree with the point made by Thomas that what we have witnessed in this first wave of reactions to the coronavirus crisis in Europe was something which we could describe in terms of the Hobbesian moment in Europe. I don't share the point of Thomas about nationalism. I think that was much more Hobbesian than about nationalism or any national resentments in Europe. But of course, they can come. They can come later in Europe, especially during the second wave of the crisis, which will be of the economic character. And in this moment of new economic challenge to Europe, the problem of nationalism and national responses will be for sure a huge challenge for the European Union. So at the first moment, what we saw was rather this Hobbesian instinct of the states in Europe that governments and states tried to show that they are capable of protecting own people. But now I think decisive for the European Union is capability to react to this second wave, to economy, and what we see now is rather a reluctant, very reluctant, and I am very interested what Thomas will say to that problem, very reluctant attempt to restore in another, this time European moment, Hamiltonian moment, and the problem of the common debt, about Corona bonds, and the change of the Eurozone. But this is not the whole problem. This is only one part of the problem. We have to confront us with the question how to keep the European Union together, and this is related not only to Eurozone. This is also related to the common market, and what we probably will witness is the attempt to relax many rules of the common market as a response to the upcoming economic crisis. But how to keep the European Union together in such a situation? And maybe one point more, I think that this preliminary reactions to the crisis will have an impact on the whole discussion about the common European security, because what we saw is probably a problem to react together to the unexpected threat, and I understand the reasons why some people criticize Macron's war metaphor, but there is something in that, because we have to imagine through this experience of our reaction to Corona crisis in Europe, how we would react, for example, to the threat of war. So I think that this experience will have an impact on the whole discussion, European discussion about the common security policy for the future.
So Mark actually gave me a perfect transition, because in fact we do, of course, have to talk about the sort of next huge challenge, which is nearing on the horizon. And as he kind of mentioned, recently led by Italy, Spain, and France, some EU countries sort of reintroduced the, in Germany, dreaded idea of Eurobonds, this time calling them Corona bonds. So an idea of kind of debt mutualization for what's certain to be, the economic fallout from this. I mean, I was trying to get numbers on this. The estimates seem to vary between a very optimistic kind of 5% hit to economies all the way to something like 20%. So, I mean, we are potentially looking at really, really dramatic pain processes here coming up in the future. And the first attempt was made by these countries to broach this topic again. And again, you had what they were calling the Frugal Four, I think, with Germany once again in the lead, absolutely rejecting any kind of idea like this. So, and of course, as the Marshall Fund, we have to point out that people were using also this idea of another Marshall Plan for Europe. This time, one we should note, completely absent of the United States. But so I am going to, of course, start with you, Thomas, and I'm guessing Yasha's going to want to get in next. What about this, right? Where can we expect? Don't we have to expect more kind of grandiosity in a response to something this big on the European continent after this? What do you think?
Thomas, you're on mute.
Yes, allow me one mini response to each of them. Whether that's Hobbesian or nationalist is yet to be. But I will take that point, Mark, and think about chew on that a little bit and what the distinction really is. And I think we also need to be careful not to fall, Yasha, not to fall into the trap of the narrative that the nationalist side is and in some ways the authoritarian, not even the nationalist side, is putting to us that they are the efficient team, and we're not the efficient team. And I know you're not saying this, but we have to be careful. South Korea has been an efficient democracy, and Iran has been an inefficient autocracy. So let's not put too much. Let's not be too critical of ourselves. Yes, we're making mistakes in this, but we're not the only ones making mistakes. That just a preliminary, a little response. Your question, Rachel. This is an unusual moment that requires unusual measures. We have to help Italy and other people most affected by this crisis. We have to. As I said, I am appalled by the lack of help that we have, the lack of a helping hand that we've been extending. Now, the question of bonds is an interesting and complicated one, and it is one that has deep ideological divisions across Europe. A Corona bond would be different from a Euro bond in that it is a one-time special purpose vehicle on a one-time type of catastrophe. It is also unrelated to the economic performance of any of the countries involved, because it is a natural disaster that we're responding to in some ways. So there is an argument to be made for the mutualization of the burden coming out of this. Whether this is going to have to be a Corona bond, I am not certain. And I am not certain because a bond issuance is a transfer of sovereignty, as we barely have seen one. And even if tomorrow the Frugal Four dropped their, or anybody else dropped their complaints and their resistance to it, you would have to go through a long-term process of approving this, because it has constitutional ramifications. And therefore, I think, as much as we like this idea, or as some people like this idea, it's just an impractical instrument as a crisis response vehicle. There is a crisis response vehicle in place. It's called the European Stability Mechanism. Now, the countries, and it is working. It has money, and it has an institution that is working. Why not use it? Well, the reason folks in the South don't want to use it is because it comes with conditionality. This is the Troika riding into Athens, the picture of all of that. That's not going to necessarily happen in this case. It is, you don't have to have a tough conditionality. You can actually agree on low conditionality. So I think the ESM is the better instrument. And one last argument, Italy is facing the third crisis in a decade, and it is the third crisis following the debt and finance, the migration, and now the Corona crisis. And 3 times in a row, the Italians are complaining Europe is not helping them. If we fail in helping Italy especially, but it's not just Italy, but primarily Italy, the consequence within the Eurozone and within Europe in terms of electoral behavior of Italian voters will be grave. We will have a European crisis if we do not move forward in helping those most directly affected.
Yeah, I very much agree with that last point. Look, I mean, the one reassuring thing is that whatever crisis Europe faces, we can always discuss Eurobonds, whether it's an economic crisis, whether it's to do with refugees, or whether it's to do with a virus. We will always have Eurobonds. I don't have any particularly strong views about, Eurobonds versus other kinds of mechanisms, What I do think is that Europe now faces 2 crises which are deeper than we want to acknowledge. And the first, both of them are brought into relief by Corona, but neither of them originate from Corona. So the first is that the Eurozone has the same structural problem it's had since the very inception, which is that it is a monetary union without a political union. And it was always clear that, we had somehow gotten through the last crisis. We can have an argument about how well or badly, without fundamentally solving that underlying tension. And now we're clearly about to have the next economic crisis. And so, as everybody predicted, those tensions are going to come to the fore again. And I slightly doubt that anything that's on the table right now is actually going to solve that. I mean, can we sustain a situation in which that structural feature of our problem just remains on the book for the next 30 years? And whenever there's an economic crisis, whether it's a more ordinary economic recession or sort of exogenous shock like one we're living through right now, brings the Eurozone to breaking point again each time. I think that's the debate we should be having, but it goes a little bit beyond Eurobonds. The second problem on the legitimacy of the EU is that, perhaps there's three crises. The second one is the one that Thomas outlined, which is to say, if countries feel like they're being completely left alone in a moment of literally existential danger, that will obviously make it easy for illiberal populists to win elections in those countries. And let's not forget that Italy has only solved its domestic political problems through parliamentary maneuvering. And so it now has a somewhat competent, not ideal, but somewhat competent government. But that's only a panacea till the next elections. And at those, Matteo Salvini remains favored to win. And certainly if Italians then feel that Europe has completely abandoned them, Matteo Salvini is likely to be the person best able to exploit that. Now, the third crisis, which is related, is one of deep legitimacy for the European Union. Look, I can see why German citizens understand the need to share their sovereignty with citizens in France or in Sweden or in Slovakia in order to deal with mutual problems. It will be more and more difficult to explain to German or French or Swedish or Slovakian citizens why they should share their sovereignty with a dictator in Hungary. And unfortunately, Viktor Orban has now used the excuse of Corona, because the measures that he's putting forward are not directly related to Corona, in order to indefinitely suspend the parliament, give himself the power to rule by decree, and make spreading quote-unquote false rumors on social media punishable by time in jail. And that is not just a tragic moment for democracy in Europe and the hopes we all had for democratic transitions after 1989. It is also an existential crisis for the EU, because if the EU tolerates for a long time a dictator in its midst, it undermines in a radical way the legitimacy of the whole project.
So thank you, Jascha. I am first gonna sort of flag to everyone watching this that now would be the time to submit your questions either in the Q&A or probably in the chat function. I will see them as well. And while you're typing and thinking, I'm gonna ask something and pretend it's a question as opposed to continuing the conversation, which is Marek. I'd like you to respond and add to what Jascha said. This new legislation in Hungary was, a plan waiting for an opportunity, maybe. And what do you think the response should be from, Hungary's neighbors, from the EU, and how worried are you about this being an example that, in the medium term, longer term, some governments might be tempted to follow?
I think, first of all, I wanted to say that I agree entirely that priority should be now to help Italy. I understand the need to protect Eurozone as a project. And I understand also the problem of the problem you called as illiberalism in Europe, or national populism, which is to me much more aptly to describe the problem. And these three problems Italy aid to Italy, Eurozone, national populism, and I would add to keep the European Union together, are interrelated to me. Now, Hungary, I think I understand the political need to keep certain narrative about illiberalism, but I think that this is probably premature to draw too many concrete conclusions, because we have not only the case of Hungary, which is worrying, of course, because of the new rules of the state of emergency. By the way, in Poland, the democratic opposition, parliamentary opposition, accused the ruling party that it doesn't take the same decision to introduce the state of emergency. But we have also other examples, very worrying examples of Spain, for example, where many of political freedoms and individual freedoms are limited as the response to the very grave crisis about coronavirus. So I think I am not so keen to draw too strong conclusions now. I think it is premature, and we should be aware not to provoke too much national resentments, which probably await us in the second wave, in the economic wave of the crisis. So I think we have to wait where this situation will heat, especially during the second economic wave of the current crisis.
Okay. Yeah, Yasha, do you want to get in really quick on that, or?
I was going to tell you that you're on mute, but sure. Why don't I take 30 seconds just to say that I think that that is whataboutism in its purest form. There is a real need to take extraordinary measures right now in order to contain the spread of this disease. And those aren't easy questions. I think there's very hard questions about what kind of restrictions on the freedom of movement we should tolerate, what kind of state power we should be able to exercise in order to make sure that people who do have a disease, who might be exposed to it, are effectively quarantined. Those are very, very tough questions, but they relate directly to a compelling need to save lives. And so we can have a legitimate debate about whether Spain went too far on certain items, or perhaps whether some countries are not going far enough. But it is in fact related to dealing with the coronavirus crisis. To give somebody the indefinite power to rule by decree, to suspend parliament indefinitely, to give a government the power to jail people for spreading quote unquote rumors on social media, none of those things are directly necessitated by the extraordinary challenge to save lives right now. And to draw a parallel between the Spanish government saying this is the epicenter of the disease and we're going to restrict movement from that area because that's what we need in order to save lives, and the naked power grab that is going on in Hungary, I think frankly is stretching the limits of good faith.
Thanks, Yasha. So we had Professor Krzysztof Pisz, whose name I'm sure I'm not pronouncing correctly, from Lazarski University, submit a question earlier. Actually, he submitted 3, so I'm going to pick the one that I like most, at least to start. We have a couple other questions that have come in. So the first from Professor Krzysztof Pisz: what are the important or most important characteristics of a leader in difficult times? Either in general, what do you think, or pulling out from examples that we've seen so far in this crisis? I'd be interested if anyone has thoughts. Yep, Mark?
Also for me, it is at first a capability of taking responsibility. And this taking responsibility is the first and the most important feature of taking leadership, and that was exactly the weakness in the first weeks of the crisis of the European Union, that you had the impression that no one there is prepared to take any responsibility for anything, and that was why this impression was spread out, that there is no leadership in the European Union. As I said, that was in the first moment, in the first weeks of the crisis. But it ensures me that that this is the decisive problem: the capability of taking responsibility.
I would say that perhaps there's 3 levels of sort of competence failure in a crisis situation, at least. I think at the highest level of incompetence, you have an inability to implement the playbook. So there are playbooks that countries have developed in order to deal with crises. According to some reporting, there was this elaborate exercise that the Obama team did when Trump's people came in order to prepare them for various scenarios. And one of them was, what happens if there's a pandemic? And so the first level of competence is, well, there is the playbook of how you go about dealing with something like a pandemic. Do you have enough administrative capacity, enough trust in the system, enough competence to actually follow that playbook? And the Trump administration has failed that, as have people from AMLO in Mexico to Bolsonaro in Brazil, because they've been unwilling to face reality. I think the second level of competence is, are you capable of assessing when the playbook is in fact a good model for what you have to do, and when you have to go beyond the playbook because the crisis you're facing is different from what you might have been expecting, or more extraordinary than what you might have been expecting. This is, I think, where a lot of the European governments have failed. So they have reached the second level of competence of following the playbook, but they have not reached the third level, which is to go beyond mere following the playbook, to recognize that we're in an extraordinary situation which might require new measures. They have eventually done that, but crucial weeks were lost, which we will pay dearly for in terms of human lives and in terms of economic ramifications.
So there are some questions that have been written in the chat function. If any of the panelists want to look and sort of pick one, if you like one. In the meantime, though, we did have time to talk about the kind of the EU response and what it might mean for European cooperation, but we just barely touched on international cooperation, which is part of the title of the event. And Thomas, you had mentioned being the great German optimist, that it could be that this will be a great a kind of great renewal moment once we see how serious this crisis is, and that it can only be dealt with internationally. So even though, as you mentioned, there was no international response, perhaps because there was no international leader who was interested in an international response. But where do you see it going? Do you think we can correct from where we are now in terms of the UN, the WHO, or international measures and cooperation on this? You're muted, Thomas.
I'm sorry. I'll get it eventually. I think I would distinguish between internationalism and the international institutions. Those are two different things. I think the impetus, that the initial national resorting to national power, understandable as it may be, will be overridden by the insight that only when we have helped the last country on earth will we have beat back this this virus. Otherwise, it will come back to bite us. So this is a transferable lesson that I think will have an educational impact that will spur, and if executed well, we're in the early days. If international cooperation can show some benefit, it will be a teaching moment, and it will be transferable to issues from terrorism to climate change. Different with regard to the international institution. I just don't know whether the WHO is part of the solution of the problem or part of the problem. So far, they've proven themselves to be a part of the problem, rather. So I'm not sure whether I want to give more authority to them, as some people, including the presidents, are suggesting with their new initiative. Comes a second element of the problem added to this. With the disinterest of the United States in international institutions, their lack of filling personnel, the Chinese have eaten up this space in no time. You could argue there has been a lack of representation of China in international institutions for quite a while, and this representative gap is now being filled. But it is being filled at a price, and we're feeling this price that that institution, and the WHO is front and center of this attempt to turn into Chinese institutions an international institution, or have it play by the Chinese playbook. There is understandable resistance to that notion, and we haven't found an answer to that, and we haven't found especially a quick answer in a moment of crisis where a hidden institution, like, it's not as if the WHO is sort of front and center all the time. It is front and center now, or should be front and center now, but then it isn't. So I wouldn't put too much weight and too much credence into first reforming the international system. We've uploaded more problems onto the international system.
Marek, yes, I'm going to go to you. I just wanted to note, because I forgot to say this, the question I asked came from Donatien Roy at CSIS in Washington, in case you didn't see that. So Marek, your response?
Yes, maybe 3 quick points to the questions at chat, because I followed these questions too. So first, about Hungary and Poland. Still, we should stick to facts, and the facts are, in Poland we have no state of emergency, we have no ruling by decrees, we have the suspension of parliamentary control and accountability. So I think we should not blur the division line between these two cases, Hungary and Poland. Secondly, a very interesting question about the Chinese assistance to Europe. I think it's a very interesting case, because this was, to me, maybe I am wrong, but I read it in that way, that this was the attempt to establish a kind of soft power or soft influence of China on Europe and the situation of crisis, and of course to cover own responsibility for the whole global crisis we have. And probably what we have ahead of us is the discussion about Chinese responsibility and how the Chinese state behave in the situation, especially in December last year, facing the first symptoms of the crisis. And this discussion will probably accelerate, unfortunately, of course, the conflict between United States and China. I will expect a sort of blame game, who is more responsible for what. And finally, my last point, what we see, and I agree with Jascha and Thomas in this, is probably the entire dismantlement of the American leadership under Trump, and this this will for sure have an impact on the European discussion, especially in this part of Europe, in Central Europe, because we saw United States behaving as a non-leader in the first weeks of the crisis, and this experience will remind with us.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mark. I'm gonna, Yasha, give you the last word, other than my final last word, because we are actually, unfortunately, already at the end. This could have been a 3-hour conversation easily. So there's a lot of things that you could talk about. I think the question of, U.S. leadership, is there any kind of immediate future we can see in a transatlantic cooperation in this space, but also maybe the question also of what it means for our democracies and a kind of democratic support for international cooperation and cooperation.
Yeah, well, look, I think it's helpful to disaggregate those questions. I think this crisis does show us the limits of international solidarity in a way that's not going to change. I think European governments could have acted a lot better. They could have been much smarter at cooperating in this crisis. Certainly, it's a crying shame that there's empty hospital beds in some European countries, while doctors in other European countries have to decide who lives and who dies, depending on their decision about who gets a ventilator. But I think, the nation state is still deeply ingrained in the heads of people. And when it comes to life or death decisions, they are willing for ventilators to be redistributed between Berlin and Bavaria. They're not willing for them to be redistributed between Germany and Italy, if it might mean that Germans might have a higher chance of dying. And I think that's unfortunately a reality that perhaps not forever, but certainly in this broader political moment is baked in, but we can't get around. Now, I think in other ways, we will see, hopefully, a renaissance of people giving importance to international institutions that actually work well. And as a number of us have pointed out, some of them, like the WHO, really have not worked well in this crisis. And particularly believe in experts as neutral arbiters that are actually motivated by things like saving lives rather than by political maneuvering. I do think it's been striking to see that all the warnings that people make about the rise of politicians that don't care about experts, that don't care about independent institutions, that politicize everything, that make the response to anything down to how it affects their electoral chances, are very difficult to communicate to people in normal times. Because the damage that this does is not very visible, it's hidden, it's complicated. And the people making those warnings tend to be elites like us on sort of nice GMF events. And so it's easy not to take them seriously. Well, I do think that this crisis is going to make people ask, well, how is it that we've ignored the advice of public health experts to ramp up our pandemic response? How is it that political leaders from Trump to Bolsonaro have claimed that this isn't a real danger when scientists were shouting at them to say, please, please, please take this seriously? And that will undermine confidence in them. And so when it comes to transatlantic relations, I really think elections are the least important thing right now, because it really is still a matter of saving hundreds of thousands of millions of lives around the world. But even though Trump is riding high in the polls right now, he's more popular than he has been at any point since the last few weeks of his presidency. I think by November, Americans will have recognized what a failure his leadership has been in response to this and in other ways. And that'll hopefully open the way for better transatlantic relationships and a little bit more sensible internationalism from the United States.
Okay, those sounds like really good sentiments to end on. We could have talked a lot more about sort of society's resilience that we're seeing, how this could turn into a quick learning curve to make our also our leadership and our structures more resilient once we start again listening to experts and taking these things more seriously. So I want to thank you, Jascha, Marek, and Thomas, very much for joining me. I want to thank my colleagues, Michał and Marta, in Warsaw, very much for organizing this. I thought it was really interesting. Maybe next time we'll make it 2 hours.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.